Hi everyone, this is BritSimon. Particularly for DV2021 selectees. It's always interesting to get some background data to understand some of the process. So this video is going to be particularly interesting, as I say, to DV2021 selectees, but this might be interesting to other people who study the lottery process as I do. So let me just run through some data that's been made available this week. It's only just been made available. So if you Google DV lottery statistics, you'll come to this page, which is a useful page, which gives us three main groups of statistics. Firstly, there are some PDFs which I'm going to show you in a moment, which show the number of entries received in each year over the years from 2007 now to 2021. This 2019 to 2021 spreadsheet was just added this week. I think on Tuesday or Wednesday I noticed it. And I check this often, so it's pretty clear it just got added. Then there's a number of selected entrants for recent DV programs. This data here is up to 2018, but of course we know the selectee counts from the visa bulletins, but every so often they take that visa bulletin information and put it onto this area. And then finally, there is a number of issuances and adjustment of status information and this shows as a I'll just show you briefly what this looks like. This shows the numbers for each country over a period of time. It is possible, though, to get more recent data than this. You can modify this. Actually, this might even work. So if we look at I think the 2018 data is definitely available. So if you modify the link, no, it didn't work, but there is a way of getting the data, the more recent data than the 2017. So we can actually see the number of people who get visas in any given year, right? So that's all useful information. I'll just briefly show you the number of selected entrants. You'll recognize this format from the visa bulletin, and as I mentioned, it's just basically the visa bulletin information that we see put into this separate page. But what I wanted to show you today is this new data. This has only just been published. It's the data from 2019 to 2021 for the number of entrants, derivatives, and therefore total in each country that entered the lottery, right? So when you receive your letters that say, congratulations, you've been selected, there's a number in there which shows the number of entries per year. And in a typical year, we've been seeing numbers of, you've been chosen of, one of the selectees out of 21 million or 22 million people, right? And it sounds extraordinary. But in reality, you can get the information behind those numbers here. And they only publish this information in 3 yearly chunks of data. So just right now, we happen to have got the drop of 2020, 2021, and 2019 data, even though 2020 is still ongoing but almost finished, and 2021 is just about to start, right? So it's kind of interesting. But I think what I want to show you is I want to show you what an incredible difference the new passport rule made. So we know that there's a lot less entries in this year, but this data really shows where the difference happened. So we can see, for example, if we look at FY19, fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20, and we focus on the number of entrants, that's the individual entries. So one person that enters, is an entry, and they include their family members on that entry, right? So you list your spouse and you list your children, etc. So the entries number is the number of entries and who would be chosen as principal winners, and the number next to it is derivatives associated to those entries, right? And so we get a total number of entries per region, per country, and it's useful data, and I'll show you how in a moment. But we can see that, for example, in FY19, there were nearly 11 million entries from Africa, there were 7.8 million entries, which composed of 11 million people if you add in the derivatives. And similarly, in fiscal year 2020, 11.3 million people are on the 8.145 million entries, right? But look at the number, how the number dropped. Instead of 8 million entries here in 2020, that number went down to 3 million entries. Okay, so the people who are selected in DV2021 weren't competing with 8 million entries, they were only competing with 3 million entries, which massively increased your chances of selection. I explained this to people before the entry last year. I said that this would be an excellent time to enter, and I just produced a video yesterday saying the same sort of thing for DV 2022. It really is. It's a positive thing, for your chances of selection. But what's interesting also is to look at the country reductions, and I'll show you this same reduction basis in other regions in a moment. I'll show you this data in detail. But look at some of these countries. The most obvious example is Ghana. Ghana had 2 million entries in 2019 with 238,000 derivatives, so 2.25 million people. Then similarly in 2020, 1.9 million, just over nearly 2.1 million people. But look at the drop in 2021. 298,000 entries, so 1.6 million entries less than in the previous year. Why? Well, because the passport requirement has reduced fraud and reduced the instances of people, entering multiple times. That was exactly what it was intended to do, and it's particularly hit Ghana, for example, in this case, because there was a lot of that sort of fraudulent entry going on there, frankly. Now, some countries have been very little impacted. For example, if we look at, just randomly, I'll choose Angola. Angola had 17,000 entries in 2019, 15,000 in 2020, and about nearly 15,000 in 2021. Okay, so not much difference for them. Why is that? Well, they didn't have a lot of multiple entries. They didn't have a massive number of entries. And I've known for years, by the way, that this number in Ghana was complete BS nonsense. And I pointed this out a few years ago to some people. And let me just quickly show you why I knew. If you look back at Ghana for earlier times, you'll see that if you look, it was slightly different. They didn't organize it by region before, but here's Ghana. So Ghana had 400,000 entries in, 2010, right? So 400,000 entries. And the proportion of derivatives is, somewhat sort of reasonable. It's a higher proportion compared to that number. Then you see in the next year 482,000 entries, and the derivatives portion stays roughly the same. That's odd. Why is there nearly 20% more entries, but the rate of people entering with family stays the same? And lo and behold, in the next year, you see, again, a similar sort of massive increase, 641,000. So look how that increased. So it increased by 50% more than 50% increase in the number of entries, and almost no difference in the number of derivatives. So the 50% increase was almost entirely due to single people, and frankly, that was an indicator to me that was fraudulent. The other indicator, was just the massive increase we saw in entries. So that was 2010 to 2012. We saw the same sort of thing in the same sort of increase, I should say, in the next year. So again, they've gone up to 900,000. Now again, this is a doubling, over double the number of entries, and a very small increase in the number of derivatives. You just can't have that happen. Is it that all of a sudden people in Ghana are not getting married? No, of course not. It means that there are lots of proactive single applicant entries being made, probably by agencies or scammers. Look at this, 1.085 million entries there, 132 derivatives again, 132,000 derivatives. It's not until we don't see an increase in the number of derivatives until we get to 1.5 million entries. So, clearly there was something weird going on, and as I say, this data for years has been telling me information about, about some of the countries, and I've highlighted Ghana. It's not a it's not. I'm not picking on Ghana, but Ghana is the most obvious example of this kind of crazy, kind of obvious fraud that's going on. And frankly, that's the sort of fraud that they were trying to stop with the new passport rule. Okay, so now this data isn't just for Africa, it covers other regions as well. All the countries are here, so there's the Asian countries there, and you can see, again, sort of big decrease in the number of entries overall from 3.5 million people down to 2.3 million people. For Europe, I went from 7 million people down to 3.9 million people. And so on. The Bahamas is always tiny. People ask me about the Bahamas and why North America region is the Bahamas, and people ask me why I don't spend any time talking about that. Well, you can see the number of entries. They had 937 entries in DV2021. So God bless you if you're one of those people that won in North America. I love hearing from you guys, but I don't spend a lot of time on analysis for North America. Oceania, so a little bit of a decrease there. Again, not massive, and again a little bit of a decrease, sort of 65% or so, for South America. So you can see the sort of the process here. Overall, there was a halving of the number of entries down to just under 12 million from the previous year being over 23 million and the year before that being over 22 million. So it's a halving of the entries, but most of that reduction came in Africa. Okay, now hopefully this is interesting information to you, so you'll stick with me for a few more minutes. I want to show you, what I've been doing with that data. So I took the data, put it into a spreadsheet, and first of all, I created a column here which takes the difference between that number of entrants this year and the previous year there, right? So as I mentioned, Angola has almost no difference. It's a 99% number there. That's a percentage in this column, the entries difference. So you can see some countries were massively impacted. So Burkina Faso, massively impacted, but not a large number of entries. But it went from 30,000 down to 6,000 entries. Right, so there's quite a big difference there, but it's not a particularly huge country, so I'm not going to labour the point on that. Cameroon had a big decrease in entries, 300,000 down to 150,000, so 49%. And if we look at some of the other big countries, Congo obviously is broken up into Brazzaville and Kinshasa these days. That's the way they term it. But you can see Congo, Kinshasa. 593,000 compared to 924. So a sort of a two-thirds number there. They lost 1/3 of their entries, right? Ghana, as I mentioned, 16%. Crikey. Another one that went down by 16% is Liberia, or went down to 16%. 16% of the previous entries. And again, there's Sierra Leone, right, 6%. So it went down. It's had 1 million entries in 2019, nearly 1 million entries in 2020, and 57,000 in 2021. I mean, it's staggering. So you can see the countries that were most impacted by the passport rule, and there's two things I would say about that. Number one, on these larger countries that had a large explosion of entries, it probably reveals that there was some fraud going on. But it also is indicative of the countries where people find it difficult to get a passport or find it expensive. right? So there are some countries which certainly have been impacted negatively, for that reason too. And again, most of those countries are in Africa. So, it doesn't mean necessarily that all the countries I'm pointing out here with the very small percentages are all impacted by fraud. It could be impacted by an inability to get a passport, or the relative cost of that passport being so huge for an average person that they just didn't do it, or they weren't able to do it. But we'll see. What happens in this next year. So that was one thing I wanted to point out, the difference in entries. Then we've got some slightly more interesting information that we can work out. So what I've done is I worked out, if you know the number of entrants and the number of derivatives that entered, you can get to a derivative rate by country. So you've probably heard me before talking about derivative rate, and in fact, if you look at one of my earlier spreadsheets, which is this one, I've talked about this spreadsheet where I've gathered a bunch of data, and I predict the number of cases for each of the years, right? So the number of 2020 cases, etc., the number of 2021 cases I expect based on the derivative rate. So for Africa, I was assuming a derivative rate of 1.6, and I had, we'll make a note of these, or make a mental note perhaps, but I had these other numbers as derivative rates. Now, the problem with the derivative rate for a region is that the derivative rate is not the same for every country. And this data now reveals that in clear picture, right? So if you're in Algeria, the derivative rate for your country was in fact 1.58. That means for every single entry, there was 1.58 people covered on that between the entries and the derivatives, right? If you're in Angola, that number is 2.23. There are more derivatives than there are entrants. That's what that number means. And as you go down the list here, you'll see some of the countries have very high numbers, some have very low numbers. If we look at our friends in Ghana again, although this is somewhat improved on how it used to be, we're more back to this 1.28 rate, which ties more closely to what we saw in that year in 2010, when there were 398,000 entries and 129,000 derivatives, right? So it more closely ties to that. It sort of makes more sense now. So there you go. There's some numbers down there, and when you average all of that out and you actually take this number and this number, etc., the actual number of derivatives for this year from a starting position is 1.57. I had used 1.56, I think, or thereabouts. I was pretty close on Africa, right, in my estimation. But I'm also able, because I can figure out how many derivatives there are, and I know how many selectees there are. This is the static data from the visa bulletin. This is how many selectees there are. I can now find how many cases there should be in that country based on the derivative rate for that country, right? So I divide the 6,001 by the 1.58, and it gives me 3790 cases. That number is going to be pretty accurate. It won't be exact. There'll be some anomalies, there'll be some oddball ones here, but that will be pretty accurate in terms of the number of cases that there are. And there will be some what I call derivative growth rate to consider. So that will happen as well, but you can get the number of cases per country from this. And then the other thing that you can find is once you've got the number of cases, you can figure out, okay, if I have 3790 cases based on the derivative rate that was based on this data here, let me work back and work out how many cases there were for the number of entries. Remember, it's entries that get selected, not entries and not derivatives, but just the entrants, right? So this particular country got 3790 cases succeeded from their 221,000 entries. That's what that means. And so you have a percentage selected. What was the chance of selection in that country? Now, you'll see that once you get to a country at a reasonable size, more than a few, with a country like this where there's only, let's say, 237 entrants. Statistically, it isn't going to behave correctly. It's not going to be quite as accurate to consider that, and so you see a 0.72. But what is interesting is that with almost 100,000 entries, Benin, for example, only has a 0.78 selected number. Now, again, I'm sorry to labour this point, but we're talking West Africa here. Benin's right next door to Nigeria, and that whole region is globally known as the fraud capital of the world. I'm sorry that's probably going to insult a lot of people, but that's the reality. If you don't believe me, look up Wikipedia, look up some of the scams that come from that sort of area that are actually named after that area, right? So, so what's interesting is, why did this country, Algeria, for example, get 1.71% selected, which is a very large number considering that's a capped number, whereas Benin only got 0.78. And it's because these entries are the qualified entries. So there are some mistakes that are made by by people during the entry process, and some of those are immediately knocked out. So this number, the 0.78, is artificially low for that reason. And in fact, if you look at the average chance for the region, it's 1.1%. So somehow, and I need to think about this a little bit, but somehow the chance of selection for Algerians was extremely high, which indicates that they had a good quality of case. They didn't have many mistake entries, and that's interesting. But it was higher than the regional average, and in fact, no country within this region should have any better chance or worse chance than any other country. But the results are better and worse for the reasons that I've given you, right? So I know that's a little bit complicated. You're probably a little bit confused. I understand that. But what I'm going to do is post this data, and you can have a look at the data. The data is the data. It's not, I can talk about my opinions about the data, and you can form your own opinion about the data. But the reality is the data speaks for itself, right? So have a look at this. You'll know now why I talk about this as being a pretty good year. Now, I've said in the past that people had something like a once in 200 year chance of being selected for the lottery. In 2021, in Africa, you had almost a 1 in 100 year chance of selection. Still an incredibly lucky thing to get selected, but much better than it was. Now, just very briefly, I'll show you the data for Asia. You can see the entries for Asia, but I'm also going to give you the links, and I'm going to put this data onto a Google spreadsheet so that you can see this data and play around with it yourselves. But yeah, you can see the entries from Nepal, for example. So Nepal entries dropped reasonably, but not massively. Let's look at our other biggie, Iran. Iran dropped to 400,000 from 700,000. Again, it's a drop, but it's not massive. Big increase in entries in Hong Kong, but it's not statistically a huge significant area, but but it's there. And you can actually work out, by the way, once you know the entries, you can work out and confirm some of the predictions I've made in terms of the cutoffs. If you're statistically literate, if you know how to do statistics, etc., and math, you can figure out mathematically where the cutoffs should have come and confirm the cutoffs. So, for example, we can see that there are 404,000 Iranians and 421,000 Nepalese. They both got cut off, I think, but they got a different number of selectees, right? So, and that's okay. There's good reason for that. The derivative rate in Iran is higher, so the same number of cases would result in a higher number of actual selectees. But clearly, both have been managed down, as it were. The chance of selection in in Asia was pretty low according to that. I wonder if that's correct. That looks like a mistake actually. That's not right. That's wrong. Hang on, let's do this. Auto sum on there. There we go. That's better. 1.08%. Yeah, that's the regional chance of selection. So that's by summing up all the numbers above. Okay, so that's, you can see some countries are above, some countries are below. The chance for Nepal, for example, was lower than average because they were artificially limited, much lower than the 1% the rest of the region enjoys. And if we look at the other biggie, Iran, again, they were artificially limited, and that's why that number is lower. Okay. If we look at Europe, few sort of interesting things there. Let me just check the regional chance of selection was 1.15%, based on the number of entrants and the number of selectees for the region. And then you can see some of the countries that had a massive number of selectees. For example, these numbers of selectees are very large. You can see very different behavior, for example, between Ukraine and Uzbekistan, but they both ended up with with the same sort of number of selectees, which tells me, by the way, that Uzbekistan was probably limited, whereas perhaps Ukraine has not been limited. And that's the missing link information we needed to be able to understand that. Why, otherwise, if Ukraine had been limited, it wouldn't have received 1.3% of its entries as selectees. Okay, so that's confirmation of that point. The other countries, let's just have a look at the other biggies. That was a biggie. That's Russia. Were they limited? No, they probably weren't limited. So if they were limited, their numbers go almost to the top of the range, which confirms what people have been telling me. So that's useful information. Any other biggies? No, there's no other real big ones. This one's pretty big. Again, not limited. 1.64%. It's in the right ballpark. It's a little bit more than the normal, right? Oceania and South America. The story here for Oceania is how few people enter, and what the chance of selection is. That 10% number, that's an accurate number. If you enter the lottery and you're able to charge to Oceania, your chance of selection is 1 in every 10 years. So if you're a married couple and there's 2 of you, you've got 2 chances in 10 years, right? So it really is, it's almost plannable. If you're in Australia, if you know you want to move to America and you start entering the lottery in Australia, let's say, or anywhere in the Oceania region, you could pretty much plan on winning over the next 3 or 4 years. Once you start entering, it's staggering that you have that opportunity. So there were only 8,000 people entered from Australia, and there's or 12,000 people on 8,500 cases, and 9% of those were selected. Unbelievable. There's some little countries here, 82 here. These numbers are statistically not accurate. I'm sure you understand why derivatives and numbers there don't really work at small countries. Fiji has an 11% success rate. Again, very, very good. Who else? New Zealand. Yeah, New Zealand is almost 10%. So overall, the average for the region was 10%. And then South America, finally, we'll have a look at those. Again, very low numbers. Again, we can see the differences in entries. That there's been an overall drop, but as I mentioned before, not a massive drop, just 15% than previous years. And then the chance of selection in the region was about 2.2%. That's a pretty good. So you've got double the chance if you're in the South America region than if you're in Africa or Europe or Asia, right? And you've got 10 times the chance of selection in Oceania than if you were in Africa or Europe or Asia, and 5 times the chance of selection, compared to South America if you're in Oceania. That's, I've tried to explain to people in the past, there are 5 different lotteries going on, actually 6, but there's 5 different regions. The chance of selection varies by region, not for the country, for the globe as a whole, right? So, and in South America, obviously the biggies, the big countries, Cuba had 0.84%, which is low. That it indicates to me they weren't limited in the draw, but they've been making mistakes in their entry. That's basically what that means. And I could probably help them correct that if they would listen. But we'll see. So this is another one. This is Peru. Looks like the right number of entries, about right on the percentage chance, perhaps a little bit low. Again, Peru is new to the DV lottery this year. Perhaps they made some mistakes in their entry. The other big one, Venezuela, 0.75. Again, I put that down to mistakes because overall 2.2% is should be about right. Actually, this number's not right, so that number's wrong. I'm sorry. Let me just fix that number. Auto sum on that. No, that's not right. Auto sum. Oh, that is right. I'm sorry. Beg your pardon. So that's 5,501 selectees. That is correct, and therefore that number is correct. The number of derivatives is what drives the percentage based on the number of selectees. Okay, so hopefully that's interesting to you. I'll make sure you have the links to the data so you can have a look at this at your own leisure. But I just want to put this sort of data out there. It just helps people understand a little bit how things go on. Sometimes I get questions like, I'm from Dominica. Why do only 3 people in Dominica get selected? Or why are there only 68 people from Costa Rica? Well, it's because only in Costa Rica, only 2,989 people entered. And so, if you get a low number of entries, you get a low number of selectees. That's basically what happens. And, if you have more entries in a country, you'll get a higher number of selectees. It's as simple as that. Okay, so, all right, well, I hope that explains that well enough for you to understand. Hope that information is interesting to you. And as we go through the process of trying to understand how DV 2021 will operate, how the visa bulletins will move and that sort of thing, this data is important to us to understand that as we go through. All right, everybody. All right, well, make sure you're subscribed to my channel. That's a big deal at the moment. I'm really trying to push the subscription numbers up so I can get that information out there. And if you like this particular video, please give me a like, and by all means comment in the comment section below. And if you've got questions, ask me in the comment section below, or reach out to me at the blog at BritSimonSays.com. and ask me questions there. And actually, I prefer the questions to be asked at my blog because I can keep track of the questions and answers a little bit easier there. But either way, you can ask questions on YouTube as well. All right, everybody, thank you for your time. Bye-bye now.